Yep, yeah, just muted. So that's muted, right? Turn off the microphone. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome to the first session of McMullen. As you can see, most of us are waterlogged, particularly for most folks out in virtual land. We're taking a lot of waves over the deck. And that leads us to our topic today. Speaking of waves over the deck, and that is leadership in a time of adversity. I thought it was a great title to a panel. I'm Pete Haynes, and it's my privilege to be part of this august panel. The panel addresses the leadership of Admiral Bud Zumwalt, CNO from 1970 to 74, and CNO Jim Holloway, CNO from 1974 to 78, and confronting an extraordinary set of challenges. On its own merits, the topic is compelling. Zumwalt was a charismatic leader, a leading-edge analytical thinker, and a passionate agent of institutional change. Our own Peter Schwartz right here worked for Admiral Zumwalt in Vietnam, and he can attest to all that. I recommend you talking to Peter about that. Zumwalt was an extraordinarily gifted manager and a brilliant strategic thinker. He remains, however, one of the most polarizing Navy leaders, one whose approaches and effectiveness are, as we shall see today, still being weighed by historians. Equally compelling was how Holloway navigated in Zumwalt's wake. However, the topic is equally compelling as the similarities between the challenges that CNO, Zumwalt, and Holloway dealt with in the 1970s and those of today are striking. In short, the topic is extraordinarily relevant. In 1970, the U.S. Navy, for the first time in decades, found itself confronted by a rival capable of contesting the seas. For Zumwalt, the emergence of a new and powerful Soviet Navy and the need to recapitalize the fleet and close the widening gap in sea control capabilities in the era of budget cuts and societal apathy about war and great power competition in general required drastic and fundamental institutional change. Sounds pretty familiar, huh? One cannot really overestimate the immensity of the challenges these two CNOs face. To confront the Soviets at sea, they had to argue for and afford a Navy in a time of budget cuts, social apathy, if not disdain for the military, in terms of great power competition. First, it was détente, and then the Carter administration's abject rejection of the Navy's offensive identity. Coming out of Vietnam and a cultural revolution, institutionally, these were challenging, if not dark days. They sought to change an institution resistant to change and reshape the Navy's bureaucracy as well as purpose away from strike warfare and rebalance the fleet in light of this Soviet sea control threat. They had to understand how to leverage emerging advanced technology while attracting the enlisted talent needed for an all-volunteer force to operate these high-tech weapon systems. Therefore, studying how CNO, Zumwalt, and Holloway exercised leadership in an era marked by fundamental shifts in the balance of power at sea and potentially game-changing technologies amid budget restraint is highly relevant. Fortunately, we have a murderer's row of historians today to help us learn and discuss naval leadership of an immense multivariate adversity. They are true master craftsmen of our trade, acknowledged experts on the topic, and I'm honored and privileged to be a part of that. First up is Dr. Ed Merolda. 2017, Ed was selected by the Naval Historical Foundation, excuse me, to receive the Dudley Knox Naval History Lifetime Achievement Award, as did Peter Schwartz last year. Having earned his doctorate at GW, he has authored or edited 17 publications, including this new one, Admirals Under Fire. So does everybody know if this is this being sold out in the lobby?
It's not Naval Institute, not Amazon.
Ah, gotcha. And as you will see, Ed is one of Ed's fortes is to put you in the context of the times. He knows the Vietnam era, the 1970s, extraordinarily well, and in the way he immerses you in that context is wonderful. Next is Tom Hone. On Friday night, Tom will be awarded the Commodore Knox Naval History Lifetime Achievement Award. Tom's had an extraordinary career, not only teaching at the Naval War College at NDU, but serving on the staffs of OPNAV and OSD, young historians would do well to listen closely to Tom's experiences today, learning about the Navy and applying naval history. Tom's forte, and he's really the leading expert, as is Ed on Vietnam. Tom is the Navy's the leading scholar essentially on OPNAV, on the structure of bureaucracies, how Navy leaders bent those bureaucracies to their will, and he can trend line that all down from the World War II to the present. Finally, Dr. John Kuhn serves as the Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King Professor of Maritime History for the John Hattendorf Historical Center at the War College. He retired from the U.S. Navy in 2004, serving 23 years as a naval flight officer, and taught naval military history at the Army Command and General Staff College until his current position in Newport. He has authored Agents of Innovation and 5 other books on military history, and was awarded a Mikado Prize from the Society from SMH in 2011. John's forte is, not surprising, strategy. So when you hear him talk about Zumwalt and Holloway, it's going to be in a strategic mindset, and that's what John brings today. So I'm making most of my comments up front. My comments on the back slide were probably a little more limited, but I want to kind of set the table for everybody. So Ed's paper and John's paper, there's a lot of similarities. And Ed's is balanced. He talks about Zumwalt in a critical manner, critical in terms of looking at it, not particularly in terms of judgment. And John spends a little more time on Holloway. In between, though, we have Tom Hone, who talks about his experiences in OPNAV, working with naval officers, and working with those guys who worked under Zumwalt. And what you see from Tom is, there's guys in the eyes can probably bring this out as well, and that is, was Zumwalt's effect in terms of his electric personality and hands-on, passionate leadership? How far did that affect the officer corps to, from a beneficial perspective? And the question here is, I think in terms of the short term, his leadership, probably he burned a lot of bridges, and in the short term, it probably wasn't worth it. But in the long term, does that kind of balance the scales a little more? So in other words, what I'm telling you is listen to Ed's paper closely, and then listen to Tom's and see if there's any contrast between each other. And then after you hear Tom's, wipe the whiteboard of your brain and then re-listen to how John talks about Zumwalt and Holloway. And that's a really neat relationship. In my email to these guys the other day, I said, was there another tandem in the Cold War that Holloway worked very well for Zumwalt as his VCNO, and then managed Zumwalt's wake, and then by stamping his own personnel on there. So I had to pull a Ricky Bobby quote. I call them the shake and bake leadership tandem of the Cold War, where Zumwalt shaked, and then essentially what happened was that Holloway kind of baked whatever he wanted in, and between those two, they really set the foundation in terms of strategic thinking, in terms of initiative, in terms of confidence in the Navy, that set the foundation for the maritime strategy of the 1980s and the reinvigoration of the U.S. Navy. So I'll stop talking now and hand it over to Ed. And Ed's got a slideshow. Over to you, Frank, sir.
Thank you, Peter, for that kind introduction. It's good to see many longtime friends in the audience and some new faces as well. And I hope the same, of course, virtually. Elmo R. Zumwalt Jr. and James L. Holloway III served as chiefs of naval operations at the end of the Vietnam War, at that time America's longest war. It was a time of crisis for the nation and for the Navy. Both men were superb military leaders, physically and morally courageous, inspiring to those with whom they served and who served under them in war and peace. Admiral Zumwalt, next slide, please. One of my favorite pictures of Admiral Zumwalt. It really brings out his personality. He commanded all U.S. naval forces in South Vietnam from September 1968 through July of 1970, 38,000 naval personnel. He fought the Viet Cong to a standstill in the Mekong Delta with his Sea Lord's overall strategy, and he also helped prepare the Vietnam Navy to take over the war. Even beyond his career in the Navy, and I'm going to talk mostly about his time at CNO, but beyond that, he always was a champion of veterans of the Vietnam War. I don't know how many conferences I attended at Texas Tech University, the Vietnam Archive, that he wasn't there giving a talk or somehow helped. In fact, I think he's one of the donators to their cause. And certainly he had national exposure, national recognition in his support for those exposed to the Agent Orange defoliant, the toxin, which killed his son Elmo. Admiral Holloway, Jim Holloway, served 2 tours as commanding officer of USS Enterprise, America's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. And he was commander of the 7th Fleet during 1972 and the Linebacker campaigns and the mining of Haiphong Harbor. Both were promoted to Chief of Naval Operations to reinvigorate the Navy after the very hard 10 years of the Vietnam War. The service was pooped, it was tired. Heavy combat, long deployments, long tours. Their early lifetime and Navy experiences shaped their characters clearly. Zumwalt's parents, both physicians living in California, instilled a desire in him to serve others. He was a humanitarian from day one to the end. Admiral Holloway's father, 4-star Admiral James L. Holloway Jr., was well respected during the 1950s, and he was a big supporter of naval education. Zumwalt and Holloway were classmates, both in the class of 1943 here at the Naval Academy. However, they graduated in 42. The exigencies of the war, off they went to the Pacific. They both also served at the National War College in 1962 in the same class. So they knew each other. They were very close in what they did professionally. Both earned medals for actions in the Pacific. Admiral Zumwalt was present at the Battle of Savo Island in August of 1942, and Holloway was there in Surigao Strait at the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October of 1944. They respected each other's professional skills and accomplishments. Indeed, Admiral Zumwalt made Admiral Holloway his deputy, second in command of the Navy, Vice Chief of Naval Operations in 1973, and he endorsed him as his successor as CNO. In addition to their professional closeness, they had a personal closeness. The Holloways and the Zumwalts gathered often. Holloway's wife, Dabney, and Zumwalt's wife, Musa, and the families got together quite often. They were very close personally. Despite this affinity, and this is a point I want to make, Zumwalt and Holloway took fundamentally different approaches to leadership as Chief of Naval Operations. Zumwalt was given the job over the heads of 33 other admirals. He was the youngest admiral to become CNO. And as you might suspect, that it did not endear him to the 33 passed over. Admiral Zumwalt had a lot of help from people in positions of power in Washington. Paul Nitze, an icon of the Cold War, he developed NSC-68, how we were going to get ready for the Cold War and tool up for it. And Zumwalt served him in an arms control capacity at the Disarmament Agency, and then later on as his naval aide when Nitze was Secretary of the Navy and then Deputy Secretary of Defense. He clearly was on his side. Melvin Laird, during the Nixon administration, the Secretary of Defense. And I think, well, what's the connection there? Quite early on, Laird went to Vietnam to look into the Vietnamization, turning the war over to the Vietnamese. That was his big thing. And Zumwalt was there with a briefing to say, here's how I'm going to Vietnamize the Vietnam Navy. And so that impressed Laird big time. Navy Secretary John Chafee was looking for someone to look at the personnel issues that were then troubling the Navy. So that was key. He was in his corner. And finally, General Creighton W. Abrams, commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam, for whom Zumwalt had worked. Abrams sang his praises, things like he was the greatest admiral I ever knew, he was brilliant, and so all these folks were lining up to support his nomination to be CNO. Laird, when Zumwalt came to Washington for his interviews, said, go over to the White House and talk to Kissinger and President Nixon, neither of whom knew Zumwalt from Adam, but they went with Laird's recommendation, all these other recommendations. They came to regret that support later on, but that they did pass on his nomination. The big thing that's always brought up with Zumwalt's nomination to become CNO was his lack of command experience. This comes out all the time. He had never commanded an area fleet like the Pacific Fleet. He had never commanded a numbered fleet like the 7th Fleet or the 6th Fleet. He had a relatively small naval formation in Vietnam, and those in the aviation and submarine communities considered the Vietnam experience second class, right, Peter? There's something that was not main Navy, if you will. So that was not considered a relatively small staff compared with OPNAV, which was huge in comparison. One of Zumwalt's greatest challenge was to stabilize the personnel base when he took over. The Navy was hemorrhaging sailors at that point. The war was taking a toll on people who were exhausted, but also the draft ended in January of 1973. So how do we get new sailors in? How do we keep those who are in to stay in? One of his first actions was to issue 120 electronic communications that went out to the Navy. Every sailor, every officer got access to these Z-grams, they are called, 120 of them. If you'd like to see what each one was, the Naval History and Heritage Command has each one identified and explored. The object of this was to get out to the Navy and say, hey, settle down, we're all going to get together on this and we're going to work to make the Navy better, which is a good thing. But it antagonized those senior officers who normally and senior enlisted, who would normally interpret what was coming from Washington and put their own spin on it or make it more understandable to their subordinates. This was a direct thing from CNO to every sailor. That didn't sit well with a number of people. What do they deal with? Quality of life concerns, uniforms, the types of uniforms on and off duty, beards. Beards had not been worn before that time. He's saying, let's have beards. Haircuts. You can show that. There's a good picture of Admiral Zumwalt with a mullet, I think, an early mullet. So he was sometimes he's clean shaven, other times he's like this. So, but that was what was happening. Okay, he also, and he's justly renowned for his actions to change the Navy's treatment of its African American and female and other minority sailors. This is his crowning achievement. I don't know anyone who really seriously argues that he didn't make a dramatic change in the Navy in that regard, or get things going to make those changes. He spoke specifically to African Americans and women in the Z-gram. Z-gram 66 deals with African Americans and how they need to be better incorporated and given more opportunities. Z-gram 116 dealt with women in the Navy. He established focus groups, and this is what Tom and I will maybe discuss later. Focus groups of junior sailors or sailors and junior officers to look at particular issues. He didn't go out to the OPNAV staff, let's look at this issue here. He got small groups together to do that, of young folks mostly. And he also had, and this goes back to his Vietnam time, where he had very trusted subordinates, Peter and others, have often been referred to as a kitchen cabinet, very small group of very loyal and trusting subordinates. The same thing when he was CNO, he had the same setup. He valued youthful energy over experience. Says you can charge ahead and you'll learn on the job. One good example of that, he established what was called the mod squad, the destroyer squadron, where every officer was ranked one rank below what they normally would be. And it was named after a TV program of the time where 3 young Americans went out and attacked crime. So mod squad generated a lot of heat, adverse heat. Welcome. That's all right. And it was not repeated, the mod squad experiment. He employed public relations, and he's a good-looking guy. He was very media savvy. He had bushy eyebrows, a square jaw, and he just looked great. So he put out a media blitz to say, hey, I'm head of the Navy, we're all in this together. And he put out I think it was weekly or maybe monthly, called the CNO Report, a movie about him jogging around a track or going out to visit the fleet. He had a flight jacket with a big Z on the back, like Zorro or Zumo. He wanted to highlight the fun and zest. He put this in one of his Z-gram, fun and zest of Navy life. We're out here on the briny having a great old time. I'm making light of this, but he wanted more, appreciate that you're a sailor. I would argue there are a number of external factors that undercut his social revolution. This was a social revolution that he started. Sailors were exhausted by the war. Many sailors were. There were AWOLs, there were desertions, and there was no draft, as I mentioned. People would join the Navy or the Air Force to avoid going into the jungles with the Army or the Marine Corps. He didn't have that anymore. So he had to really do extra special to get folks in. The Navy, as the other services, it's called Project 100,000, had to bring in a lot of folks to the military, many of whom were at the lowest test category. Some had felonies or various other things. So they were not the techie types that really wanted in the naval service. And also another factor, a very big factor, was there was turmoil throughout American society at this time. There was anti-war demonstrations everywhere, as we know, race riots in many of our cities, drug and alcohol abuse was abundant, and the respect for authority or the establishment was not great. But I would argue Zumwalt's unconventional, ad hoc methods of operation and his impatience to get things done overall hurt his time as CNO. There were widespread complaints from mostly the senior admirals, but also senior enlisted and others, that there was too much lack of discipline and good order in the fleet during his time. With all these relaxations of some of the rules, folks were getting a little bit lax about their dress. Admiral Moore went to Vietnam at one point, saw a sailor in headquarters whose laces were untied and hair down over his shoulder. Things of that sort kept being reported back to DC that the Navy's going to hell in a handbasket. Going back to the focus group approach, one example, he established a focus group to look at the issue of women in the Navy, how to get women in the Navy to improve their situation in the Navy. Captain Robin Quigley was the head Navy woman in the Navy at that time. Well, he didn't go to her to get her advice on how to do it. He went to this focus group, and he said to her, well, maybe you can attend or stop by, but she felt like she was out of the loop. And it led to a break between the two of them. She ended up going out to the West Coast to head a command, but she was on the outs, the admiral. Another example, one Sunday morning, the League of American Families, the wives of the POWs held in Hanoi at the time, were meeting at the Key Bridge Marriott, just out in Roslyn, Virginia. So he went to the meeting, and they told him all about how the administration was really badly handling the issue of their husbands in captivity. In other words, trying to keep it secret, I guess. Well, he got really fired up. This was him, and he got very passionate. Stormed over to the White House, uninvited, on a Sunday morning, into Henry Kissinger's office, and read him the Riot Act. This is not to make friends and win influence. And there are many instances of two of them were just at each other's throats. Um, his vision of the Navy's future, we're going to hear more about that. Project 60. As soon as he came in July of 1970, I want this done in 2 months. He didn't go to OpNav. He went to Stansfield Turner, then a captain, and Worth Bagley later, a junior rear admiral, and said, I need this done in 2 months. Turner later said that was the most frantic time of his career because he had to get this vision of the whole future of the Navy done. To strengthen sea control. Now, most of you here know that the Navy has sea control, projection power ashore, global presence as the main focuses of the Navy. He really put much more stress on sea control to control the Soviet threat. And the object of that was called the high-low mix. We need a mix of ships out there, not just a bunch of heavy 90,000-ton aircraft carriers. We need small aircraft carriers, he called it sea control ship, air cushion vehicles, and hydrofoils, things that futuristic, if you will, and the Oliver Hazard Perry frigates, which did eventually serve the fleet very well and very long. He turned off a lot of naval aviators. He's a surface warfare officer, and all the previous CNOs had been aviators. The submariners were not enamored with him. Congressmen didn't like the cut of his jibs, the key ones, the House and Senate Armed Services Committees, and some of the shipbuilding magnates who wanted to continue building big ships rather than little ones. He moved to fire Admiral Rickover, heard earlier from Kathy Williams, the father of the nuclear Navy. He had immense power within the Navy, in Congress, and elsewhere. Zumwalt took him on, and he lost. He admitted, he said, I made a mistake in taking on this icon. Rickover retired long after this fracas in 1982, and this last July, the U.S. Navy christened the USS Hyman G. Rickover, its latest Virginia-class attack submarine. So he's still held in high regard. He was then. He also picked fights with other leaders who could help the Navy. President Nixon did not like his social policies, and he said, "You're screwing up my Navy. I was in the Navy. What are you doing here?" Henry Kissinger, as I mentioned. I think it's instructive to compare the approach taken by Zumwalt and Thomas H. Moore, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, toward the rise of the Soviet threat. Both of them warned of the growing threat, the global presence of the Soviet Navy. They both opposed provisions of the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, which is being negotiated, and they both opposed the détente policy. But Moore went directly to Nixon in channels, behind closed doors and through Kissinger to express his views. Holloway took a different approach. He loudly aired his views in the media. He went before Congress and questioned the administration's policies. And he also took and I would argue, a sky is falling approach to the Soviet threat. We're going to get beat. I don't know how many times he said that over the years. If we get into a fight with the Soviets, we're going to lose. Now, obviously, that was to get resources, but it set a lot of people's teeth ajar. One reason for Zumwalt's public and emotional approach to problem solving, I would argue, was his inability to influence national security decision making. Vietnam era Joint Chiefs of Staff, of which he was a member, being Chief of Staff of the Navy, had little voice. Okay? It didn't help that the President, the Commander-in-Chief, detested General Westmoreland, who was the Army's representative. Following him, Creighton Abrams, he detested him, and he detested Zumwalt. Furthermore, as Chief of Naval Operations, Zumwalt had no statutory authority to deploy fleets. He had lost that since Arleigh Burke, 1958. And in the Jordan crisis of 1970, the India-Pakistan War of 71, and the Yom Kippur War of 73, he had no voice. I mean, he expressed himself, but he really didn't make it into the decision-making process. Another example, he bypassed Secretary of Defense Schlesinger, who followed Laird. to get a letter to Nixon. And he actually slid it through past Kissinger, past Schlesinger to Nixon's desk, where he read in the riot act about how Nixon was screwing up the SALT negotiations. Nixon threatened to fire him on several occasions. Okay? And the last one was on the last day of his term in office. He wanted to go on Meet the Press. This is before Chuck Todd, but Meet the Press and talk about SALT. Nixon said, I absolutely forbid it. Well, he went on anyway. He didn't talk about SALT, but he still went on the program. And as a last shot across the bow, Nixon refused to sign his Distinguished Service Medal for his retirement. So that is Zumwalt. James L. Holloway, of course, is much less well known than Elmo Zumwalt. But in many ways, I would argue he was more effective as a chief of naval operations, putting the Navy on the road to recovery. He took a practical, business-like approach. He had a gift for winning allies and disarming critics. He continued a lot of Zumwalt social reforms, and he even introduced his own, the Navy Affirmative Action Program, NAAP. He enabled women to serve on ships other than hospital ships, and he endorsed women going to the Naval Academy. And at the end of his term, 91 of 102 billets were opened to women. He pushed greater discipline in the fleet. One example, he prohibited the sale or consumption of alcohol at the enlisted and officers' clubs during working hours. Previously, a lot of sailors had imbibed, off they went to work, fell asleep at their machine, or just weren't up to par. So he ended that practice. Another example, the commanding officer of USS Finback, an attack submarine, was heading out of Norfolk to go to sea, and he brought on board, the CO did, a stripper. Her name was Cat Futch, and he had her entertain topless on the upper deck as the ship went out to sea. That did not win him a promotion, I'll tell you that. He also stressed that the Navy's mission was to fight and win wars. It might not be fun and zest. You know, life can be tough out here, but we're serving the nation, and we have to take that into account. Another example, he refused Deputy Secretary of Defense William Clements, who, like Zumwalt, wanted to fire Rickover. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. Not only was Rickover his mentor, but he said, he's an important guy. I'm not going to get rid of him. So that was squashed. But he was no Rickover toady. He opposed Rickover's call for an all-nuclear Navy. Rickover wanted destroyers, cruisers, and all the large vessels, plus carriers, nuclear powered. Holloway said, we can't afford that. I mean, that's just crazy. And he said, I operate off Vietnam with my nuclear carrier, plenty of conventional ships to support. We don't need it. And he won the day on that. He was for a balanced fleet, but not the high-low mix. Okay? He said the sea control ship, small aircraft carrier with dump jets and whatnot, doesn't have the power, the punch, the survivability of a 90,000-ton nuclear-powered carrier. He took a more measured approach to the Soviet threat. He was just as concerned as Zumwalt was about the rise of the Soviet Navy, but he didn't shout to the skies, we're going to lose. He reemphasized experience over youth. There were no more mod squad experiments. He also envisioned the maritime strategy of the 1980s, which most of us here will probably agree was a successful strategy. He envisioned that with what was called Naval Warfare Publication Number 1, NDP-1. Peter Schwartz here has said in the past that in many ways, Project NDP-1 was a repudiation of Project 60. Not everything, but some aspects. Holloway was respected by President Nixon. He had a very good relationship with Henry Kissinger. They had a mutual understanding of the importance of sea power and the utility of aircraft carriers in international crises. But he didn't hesitate to oppose Kissinger on various issues, including the SALT negotiations. They were going to limit Tomahawk land attack missiles to 10 cruisers. He said, this is unsat, and So they got the ear of Kissinger. Kissinger wasn't happy. He said, "You're going against what I'm trying to negotiate with the Soviets." But they held the day, and President Ford ultimately said, "We're not going to go forward with this." Well, Jimmy Carter went forward anyway. But he also, Admiral Holloway, opposed the anti-Navy policies, I would argue, of Jimmy Carter and Harold Brown, his Secretary of Defense. He enlisted allies in Congress to overturn Carter's no carriers in two defense budgets, 78 and 79. They cut out carriers from the budget. Congress reinstated them and overrode the president's vetoes. And that was big support from Holloway on that. He returned power projection and global presence on an equal plane with sea control. And he criticized the Carter administration swing strategy, which basically said, because we have too few ships, we're going to take the Pacific Fleet, put them in the Atlantic if we fight the Soviets. So this is crazy. Number one, we're really focusing the enemy can focus on us in the Atlantic. And what about our alliances with Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Australia? We're leaving them in the lurch. It's no good. His Sea Plan 2000, which I don't think Carter ever officially signed off on, but was out there, it previewed the maritime strategy of the 1980s. And I'll end with John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy during the 80s, and the 600 ship. He said the success of the 600 ship Navy owed more to Holloway than any other person. Thank you.
I'm over here.
I really have 4 points to make this morning. I'll try to make them as briefly and as clearly as I can. And if you want a copy of my paper, I'd be happy to send it to anyone digitally. I'll need a digital address for you, and I can send it along because it's somewhat autobiographical. It talks about my work as a consultant and then later as an official in the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. So first, I want to talk to the historian. What are oral histories worth? What are those memoirs worth? What about an autobiography? Are those of real value? Yes, but you have to cross from one to the other. You have to read them all because the authors will often disagree or their memories will lead them astray. Just as my memory at my age now is leading me astray. It's very handy. So I'll say that first. The method is important and valuable, and the United States Naval Institute and the Naval Historical Foundation deserve a lot of credit for collecting those oral histories. They've had some very good interviewers, the best of which I think is Paul Stilwell, who may still be doing it. Paul was a naval officer. Paul understood the Navy and its history and enjoyed both, and so he was able to help the people who were being interviewed recall events that they might not otherwise have recalled. So that's point one. Point two is, Ed's alluded to this, the impact that Admiral Zumwalt had on the maritime strategy of the 1980s. It was indirect. I'm going to argue that case to you. You may disagree, but it was indirect because it brought bright people into the Navy, especially into Oppo 6, the strategy office, and especially into Op 96, which was the analysis side. And I was a consultant for them in 1981. I have to tell you a story about that. My boss was a retired Navy captain by the name of Chuck Allen, and he was very widely read. He was a graduate of Yale University, had gone through the Navy ROTC program at Yale, had a very interesting career, 3 ship commands, major ship commands. So he was a very accomplished officer, but also an accomplished, intelligent individual. And so he was a consultant to Op 96, and I was working for him. And one day we had a short order presentation to prepare. That is, he was going to brief the next day the Chief of Naval Operations, who was then Admiral Thomas Hayward. And I was in charge of getting the brief together. This is pre-PowerPoint. Okay, this is 1981, pre-PowerPoint. If you get the briefs together, then you have to have a specialist in putting those things together. And so I think I might have had 3 or 4 hours of sleep before the next morning. We went over early into the Pentagon, into Admiral Hayward's spaces to brief. My boss was going to brief him. So Chuck introduced himself. He introduced me. He said, by the way, Admiral Hayward, if you have any detailed questions, Dr. Hone is here. He'll answer them. All right. Well, in those days, you turn the lights down for those presentations. So they turn the lights down. I've had 3, maybe 4 hours of sleep. I'm gone. Suddenly, the world changes. The lights are back on. I open my eyes and I'm looking directly at the Chief of Naval Operations. And Admiral Hayward looked at me and he said, "Bet you were up half the night trying to get this brief ready." I said, "Yes, Admiral, I was." He said, "Turn the lights back down, let him go back to sleep." But I tell this story because that was a very interesting time of my life, because I was able to meet some of the smartest young officers in the Navy. What Admiral Hayward made possible was to bring people who were commanders and lieutenant commanders into the office of the Chief of Naval Operations to do 2 things. The first thing was to show them what OPNAV was like. And you may say, what do you mean? Look at the org chart. No. Have to understand what OPNAV was like then. And that meant you had to get around it. You had to go to the different offices and you had to listen and watch. And the second thing he wanted to do was get them interested in strategy, because this is the time when the maritime strategy is being developed. So I had the opportunity in working for Op 96 to meet at least 2 future 4-star admirals. And they were then commanders. And you could tell at that time that they had the minds for this. They could do it. So it was exciting to be around them and to do it. If they needed help from me, I was happy to provide it, even on my own time. And I think that's part of the legacy, if you will. I hate that word, legacy. I hate that. But I think that was part of the influence that Admiral Zumwalt had on the maritime strategy. Ed has mentioned Admiral Turner. I was only in the room with Admiral Zumwalt once, but I actually did work for Admiral Turner, Stansfield Turner. And I taught his curriculum when I taught at the Naval War College. So I had I have a real feeling for Admiral Turner. He had a wonderful sense of humor. He was extraordinarily bright. And when I first met him and I had to start working for him, I was reminded of what Winston Churchill said about his first physical meeting before World War II, or in the beginning of World War II, with Franklin Roosevelt. And Churchill said it was like opening your first bottle of champagne. And that's what Admiral Turner was like. And he was in that line from Zumwalt to Turner to some of the other very, very bright people who have turned the United States Navy into what it is. So I want to suggest that that was one of the positive results of Zumwalt's time as the Chief of Naval Operations. Everybody's leaving. Okay, that either means I've said too much or I haven't, whatever. All right. Now, so that's the first point was on the methodology. The second point was thinking of the long-term effects of a Chief of Naval Operations, a senior officer, on the junior ones. So you have to think about that. By the time you wear stars, you have to think about the lieutenants who are watching what you do and what you are and what you say. And the third point is the development of the inner staff by Admiral Zumwalt. He created his own inner staff inside OPNAV because he wanted a staff that would respond to him individually, and he also wanted one that would assist him in the PPVS process. This was something that Zumwalt had an interest in for a long time. So he built up that inner staff. Now, why? Well, I'm going to quote from one of my own books. This is the book Power and Change, which I wrote, 30 plus years ago. Yes, I am that old. And I'm just going to quote from sort of the preface to that. When first confronted with OPNAV's complex structure, the researcher must ask how it got to be that way. The office is not like other complex businesses or military commands in the United States. At times, it functions more like a representative political organization than a military staff. Well, there it is. Zumwalt comes in as CNO. He knows what he's dealing with. He knows what this organization is. I have sat in on the program reviews. I had the great good fortune to do that several times, sitting side by side with a senior captain. And you go through the program reviews. And what you're really listening to are petitioners. They're coming in saying, well, this program is valuable, and this is how it supports the Navy and the country's strategy, and so on and on and on and on and on and on it goes, day after day. And it's a series of negotiations. What Zumwalt understood was there had to be some analysis behind that. It couldn't just be bargaining. Here we are at the table. I give you two of these, you give me one of those. It had to be based on analysis, and that led eventually to the strong analytic capability in the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. A friend and someone I respect very highly, Arthur Trip Barber, Captain Barber, who was in charge of program reviews years ago. Gosh, I keep saying that, years ago, in the late 1990s. He inherited this tradition of analysis, quantitative and qualitative analysis, using war games, for example, to decide which programs deserve support. And I think that's an inheritance from Zumwalt. And finally, I want to say something about Zumwalt and Admiral Rickover. Both individuals were after cultural change. Rickover was going to lever his organization and his authority, both in the Navy and also outside, because he was dual-hatted. He had a position in Atomic Energy Commission, now the Energy Department. He was going to change the Navy. Rickover made that very clear. And I was part of the younger generation as a boy growing up in the 50s, watching this man Rickover, who was talking about engineering, who was talking about precision, who was talking about reliability, who was talking about accountability in an area which could have been potentially very dangerous, and that was nuclear power. And so Rickover wanted to sort of take the Navy by the throat and say, you're going to get systematic, you're going to get modern, we're going to control these technologies. But if you think Rickover was a success, it took him a generation to do it. Zumwalt came in and wanted to do the same thing, wanted to change the culture of the Navy. It's got 4 years. 4 years is not enough time to do that. And so the best he could hope for was to put a foundation down. That's a metaphor. Another metaphor is plant some seeds, right? He did that. But at the same time, remember, he wanted to be a strategist. I had talks with Admiral Turner about that. And they had the mind for it, those two individuals. They had the minds to think about strategy broadly. Most people don't. And that's not a criticism, it's just a fact. I just discovered it. For example, I'll give you one anecdote from my own life. My older brother was a wonderful patent attorney. He was intelligent, he was thoughtful, he was highly professional, and he was a wonderful guy. I always admired him. Of those of us siblings in the family, he was the success. Did everything right. He married the right woman. Which was an analytic process. He had to sit down and think it through. But his older son, who is a well-known physicist and chair of a department at Columbia University in New York, his son once said to me, I've watched you and Dad talk to one another. Talk to one another over the years. You go by one another like this. You often don't meet somewhere in the middle. He was right. He was right. My older brother had a kind of mind that you find among a lot of officers who show up in important positions in OPNAV. They think in terms of A, leads me to B, leads me to C, leads me to D, and there's my conclusion. I don't have a mind like that. And sometimes the great strategists don't have minds like that either. Their minds jump around. As I said, I had time with Admiral Turner. Oh, that was always a wonder. It was always a pleasure. We'd start talking about the Navy and end up talking about music, art, culture. His mind could just cover all that stuff. He was comfortable with it. And so it was always refreshing to talk to him. But imagine being that kind of person, surrounded by all these other professionals who are excellent professionals. They'll fight and win wars for you, but they think A to B to C to D. Sometimes you need somebody who goes A, F, makes the jump. Sometimes you need that. And I think you do need it on any planning staff, whether it's a program planning staff in the Pentagon or an operations planning staff out with the regional combat commanders. You need people like that. But it's hard to foster them. It's hard to get them to develop. One of them is sitting in front of me. Yeah, it's Peter Schwartz right here. There isn't any topic related to national strategy that I would hesitate to bring up with Peter, or that he would have something to say that I would find of value. Behind him is Norman Friedman, same kind of ability to do all these different things and think about them all at once. And next to them is Jerry Roncolano, who has that ability as well. So they're important. These people are important, and there has to be a way to foster them. Because if you're CNO, you only get 4 years. That's it. And if you think that's a long time, you have something coming. Because if you're here in the academy thinking, oh, how do I get out of here? Right? No, you're not going to admit that. All right. 4 years is not a long time. And if you're the CNO, you've got people pressing you constantly to do things. And a lot of those people want you to do things, especially if they're in the White House staff, and they don't want to listen to you. They want you to respond to them. I've seen that over and over again. I had the great good fortune to serve 1 year before getting fired. We can talk about that later. As the principal deputy director of OSD PA&E, the analysis office for the Secretary of Defense. And my boss was wonderful. He was the assistant secretary, and I handled the people who came in to muscle us from the White House staff or from Congress who would come, or from industry who'd come in and say, "You idiots, what are you doing?" And I always had to deal with that. And that's what you have to have if you're going to start doing this sort of stuff. And then you have to understand, a CNO has to understand it before he or she takes that office. So that's what I want to say, just those 4 things. First, about method. Second, about the whole notion of strategy. As Ed said, Zumwalt was defeated in that field. He wasn't listened to. He expected to be listened to because he had been previously. And then that whole notion of adding analysis to the planning, programming, and budgeting process. And then finally, the cultural change. Zumwalt started it and fell on his face in some ways. But it's got 4 years. And Rickover had a generation. So the question is, if you've only got 4 years, what do you do? And that is not a problem for me, because I've been thrown out. The Navy is a harsh mistress. She uses you and then discards you. She's finished. And and there's for some people, there's a great going away. For people like me, it's put your stuff in a box and get the hell out. But that's okay, because the trip along the way can be extraordinary. And it was for me. And I've tried to put some of that in the paper. So if anybody wants the paper, leave me right on here your email address, and I'll send it to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Ed. They really, so I came out here from Kansas, from the U.S. Army War College, and as the majors learn out there, you provide preparatory fires prior to the beginning of an operation, and they've provided exemplary preparatory fires. In some sense, they may have already won the battle with the preparatory fires, leaving me not much to talk about. But I'm me, and so I'll probably talk. By the way, even though I am from the Army Command and General Staff College, where I teach history, I got 45 students this year. the papers were both written while I was the King Professor at the Naval War College. And since there is no King Professor right now to replace me, I replaced Craig Simons back there. I guess I'm sort of the absent incumbent, as I was telling John Hattendorf, as the King Professor. But these papers were written thanks to the Navy and thanks to the Naval War College supporting the King Professorship. Well, who said this? Who said this? All of this suggests that we are entering a period of significantly changed relationships in the world, and many of the comfortable assumptions concerning the ability of American military power to maintain peace, stability, and to assure the protection of our vital interests around the world may be challenged in the years ahead. Afghanistan, China, shrinking fleet, shrinking budget, challenges. This could have been said yesterday by Admiral Gilday. This could have been said yesterday by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley. This was said in the pages of proceedings by Admiral Jim Holloway in 1975. I want to start this out by talking about a dynamic, and here's where Tom and Ed have really helped me here. There's a dynamic whenever you're leading large institutional change, or where you're reacting to things like what Jim Holloway is talking about, all this stuff that's pressing in on you, making your job very, very difficult about how to proceed in the future to protect national security. And there's this dynamic. It's the dynamic of the two guys, or the two people. The Chinese have a word for it. It's called the first emperor and the second emperor. The first emperor establishes the dynasty, whether it's the Ming emperor, whether it's the Qing emperor, Kang Xi, whether it's one of the Japanese shoguns coming in and sort of establishing the dynasty. And then there's the second emperor, the consolidator. To go to that, we look at Mao has cultural revolution. Zumwalt has a cultural revolution. And then you get the consolidator, Deng Xiaoping. You know, not as flashy, not as passionate, not grabbing all the headlines, but consolidating change, keeping what's good, working to improve things that weren't so good. And so the relationship of Bud Zumwalt and Jim Holloway that I found, this sort of two guys approach, which I think is unique, is that relationship. One is trying to lead change. He's doing a cultural revolution in the Navy. He's trying to do a strategic revolution at the same time, all right? He's trying to deal with an arising threat of a communist global hegemonic, power, that's building a really big navy in China. Oh, excuse me, the Soviet Union. So that's what's going on, all right? And then he's only got 4 years, like Tom said, and he's out of there. The idea that we're going to keep Bud Zumwalt on for another 2 years and kind of pull an Arleigh Burke to get that continuity of leadership is just it's not workable. And so Jim Holloway, who's been groomed for this job, in part by Zumwalt, whom Jim Holloway disagrees with a lot of his policies, takes over, and he inherits change. So inheriting change is a form of leading change. You're kind of, this is what I got. You take over the ship, and that last guy ran it ragged, and you inherit what he left for you, all right? And now you inherit it in an entirely different paradigm, the paradigm of the all-volunteer force. You can't draft these guys. These are not guys that are trying to avoid going to Vietnam, all right? So they join the Navy, and now you can get some of those bright, talented people in, even though you'll probably lose them after 3 or 4 years. You can get them in. No, now you've got a problem of trying to keep people to man a fleet that's shrinking. But by the way, it's very, very difficult to man this fleet. So both Zumwalt and Holloway had to deal with that. So I started with that quotation from Jim Holloway to kind of highlight this idea of tipping points. Of course, I stole this from Peter when I saw his tipping point article in CNA in 2010, or his tipping point briefing, that we're at a tipping point. And Peter's waving the flag 11 years ago, and here we are. We're still at a tipping point. We're still trying to figure out what the heck we're going to do with the shrinking Navy, the declining budget, the rise of a power, the rise of great power politics, the Chinese challenge. I won't call it the threat, I'll call it the challenge. So we're at a tipping point today. Jim Holloway and Bud Zumwalt were at a tipping point. There was a tipping point after World War II, solved in some sense by the Korean War, and of course there was a tipping point that occurred after the Cold War ended. So there are these tipping points, and these guys have to deal with these tipping points. All right. Well, Zumwalt, we've kind of talked about him. So a lot of the stuff that I needed to talk to you about, I don't need to, thanks to my friend Ed Marolda. All right. He did mention the Z-grams. I'll tell you an anecdote. Like Tom likes anecdotes. I like anecdotes. I get out to Guam in 1983, young naval flight officer, an ensign, a fleet ensign, flying EP-3s. And in the wardroom there, under the shadow of the shoot down of the EC-121 plaque that we had out there in Agani, Guam, in the ready room, are two old lieutenant commanders that are going at it with each other. And one of them is saying, hey, Zumwalt broke the Navy. All right, Zumwalt broke the Navy. And the other guy is saying, no, Zumwalt changed the Navy for the better. You know, I mean, of course, the second guy, a guy named Rich Norman, who ended up working in OpNav in 956. Rich is he's telling Marcus William, also another guy who becomes a captain and ends up in OpNav, and then OSD. He's telling him, no, you know, these rap sessions that Bud Zumwalt had, he didn't call him Bud Zumwalt, that the CNO had, you know, they brought these psychologists out to one of these rap sessions. And, you know, and I was this young, you know, lieutenant on the carrier. And one of these leaders of the rap session was a civilian psychologist. And she's really good looking, and I got married to her. So I think Bud Zumwalt's changes were great, right? So anyway, yeah, that's a true story. So yeah, the Z-grams are there, and there's this cultural revolution that goes on, and I think it got the ball rolling in only a way that it probably could have been. I think it was necessary. Could have been done better. Could Zumwalt have been more diplomatic? But, you know, he also had the strategic thing, and Ed mentioned this. Both he and Jim Holloway faced this issue of the Soviet naval threat. And so I want to kind of skip ahead and not talk about Project 60, because I think he did a really good job of talking about Project 60. He didn't talk about Sea Plan 2000, but I'll talk a little bit about Sea Plan 2000, which is sort of Jim Holloway's thing. But we got to kind of remember when Ed said, you know, what the Navy, what Zumwalt wanted to do was to reprioritize sea control. What's our purpose in war? What is the Navy going to do? You know, Zumwalt inherited the Navy, and you fight the war with the Navy you have, right? Just like somebody once said, you know, former naval guy, former Secretary of Defense twice, one who Jim Holloway worked for. So you've got that strategy priority list, you know, and there's nuclear deterrence, and it's kind of over here, okay? The seaboard leg of the triad, right? And Rickover's got that, all right? He's protecting it jealously and fighting against, you know, arms limitation and stuff like that, so that he can maintain the credibility and viability of that. But then there's the issue of power projection and, of course, sea control. And sea control had been lower in priority than power projection. And along with power projection goes presence. It's kind of hard to project power if you don't have presence. So I tend to put presence and power projection together when I talk about them. But Zumwalt elevated that, saying, well, if we do fight a war, not a short war, but a longer conventional war, our main job is going to be the security of the sea lines of communication to NATO, to the main effort, which will be in Europe. That's where the Army had identified it, where the National Command Authority had identified it, it's where the Air Force identified it. So we need a Navy to do that. In order to do that, we're going to push that sea control thing up. All right, and that was Project 60, but it was a reaction to this idea that warfare had changed. There was the Yom Kippur War. There was also the Easter Offensive in 1972, and these new guided munitions, so surface-to-air missiles, anti-tank guided munitions, anti-ship cruise missiles on ships. They changed warfare. You know, I had Barney Rubble, Captain Robert K. Rubble, Barney to his friends. Barney was saying, hey, you know, I was there during DEFCON. What was it? DEFCON 3 we went to, and the Yom Kippur War. I was there when we had no answer for the cruise missiles on board the Soviet ship of the Eskadra that was in the Mediterranean. We didn't have an answer for that. And of course, Bud Zumwalt and Jim Holloway knew that. They saw the threat reports in the Army. William Depew, the first ever head of TRADOC, a guy that Bud knew from his time in Vietnam. He was trying to work on how do we deal with this. We're going to have to design an entirely new doctrine called active defense. And in some ways, that active defense sort of it gives us a view of what's going to happen in the Navy. Yeah, the Army later develops air-land battle from active defense. So what we'll see in this evolution of strategy inside the Navy, as well as we see it inside the Army, is sort of the first cut doesn't work. So think of Project 60 as Depew's active defense, all right? And then think of the maritime strategy and maybe Seaplan 2000, which is its precursor. And I totally agree with Ed that Jim Holloway is the guy who laid the groundwork for that maritime strategy that Peter and all these bright, talented folks later wrote. That's where we're going. And so that kind of lines up with sort of air-land battle. So it's not just taking place in the Navy; it's taking place in the other services as well. Okay, all right. So now I want to kind of jump ahead to I've kind of gone through that, and there I've got it dog-eared, so I can go right to it. So James Holloway inherited change. He inherited a huge cultural problem. I mean, the Navy was bleeding people. Ships couldn't get underway. They were failing their OPEs. Those are their operational propulsion examinations. They weren't ready. Their sword status was like 4, 5, 6. I mean, and you couldn't man these things. You couldn't keep the sailors that could work on them. There was just this bad morale everywhere. You know, the joke about the 70s is if you can remember the 70s, you weren't part of the 70s, right? So, but Jim Holloway and Bud Zumwalt, they were there for the whole time, and believe me, they remembered it. So Jim Holloway inherits this in 1974 when he comes in, a strategic challenge and a cultural challenge. I'm going to focus mostly on the cultural challenge. I can skip ahead because Ed already kind of dealt with Jim's background and what he did as a youngster in World War II in Korea. I don't have any combat medals that Jim Holloway earned in combat over Korea. You know, service guy, and then he goes and becomes a naval aviator, or maybe he was doing a naval aviator off-cycle tour. I don't remember which, but and he had commanded the Enterprise, and we heard about that. And linebacker one was a critical factor. I don't think we remember that in preventing the collapse of South Vietnam, at least in 1972. But it was this database that guys like James Holloway looked at as they're trying to figure out how to do their job once they took charge. The challenges he faced were equally as daunting. You know, a declining budget, a shrinking fleet, a growing Soviet naval threat, and perhaps the worst period for what became known as the Hollow Force. So I just wanted to emphasize those again. Now, Ed had mentioned, Zumwalt is continually talking about how the Navy's going to lose. So we've got a 50% chance, you know, in 1972 of beating the Soviet fleet. We've got a 40% chance. I mean, it goes down and down. And even later, he said, well, if we'd had to fight the Soviet fleet in the 1970s, we would have lost. Okay, we would have lost. That's what he said. At the same time, the American public was decidedly ambivalent about the Navy. And with the elimination of the draft, the Navy had a harder time than ever. Holloway was a steady as she goes steward, but he wasn't inactive. He wasn't, you know, asleep at the wheel. His leadership provided stability. He had to deal with détente. Détente was sort of this thing that said, well, we really don't need to worry about the Soviets. Yeah, they're building their Navy up, but we've got a modus vivendi. That's why we can live with the Soviet Union, all right? And when he took charge, the fleet had dropped to 512 active warships. And again, I will tell you, many of these ships were undermanned and couldn't even pull out of port. Of course, 512 makes you guys a little jealous today, right? With the numbers, about half of that we have in the Navy now. By the time he got his first budget together, it had dropped to 477 ships. Okay, the lowest number since prior to World War II. And there was no real maritime strategy. There had been Project 60 and the idea that job one is going to be the sea lines of communication to Europe and the nuclear deterrent. All right. And again, Ed's already emphasized how Carter and Brown, the Secretary of Defense, were very parsimonious with respect to the Navy. They were against the big carriers. They weren't convinced that the aircraft carrier had the relevance that it would be needed for a war with the Soviet Union. And of course, Jim Holloway pushed back against that. And it was not just the size of the Soviet Union, as 1973 had shown, but its activities. Just after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was a tipping point for the Soviets, the Soviet Union started its annual exercises. They weren't called Okean exercises yet, but they conducted their first of an every 5-year cycle that later became what were called the Okean exercises. And these exercises cost first Zumwalt and then Holloway no end of pain and suffering as they tried to design the Navy and build the Navy and a strategy that would address a global Soviet threat. Okean 1970 and 1975 get more press, but some of these earlier exercises were very important, just as important as well. The Soviet fleet, while we're dropping below 500, the Soviet fleet increased to 1,000 warships. So too did the size of the exercise. By the 70s, the numbers of these participating ships were in the hundreds, like hundreds of ships out at sea operating, all right? Like deploy the whole US Navy and you get a few of how many ships some of these exercises took. Now, some of these Soviet major combatants weren't really that big. I mean, if we're counting things like Petyas and Krivaks, but still, it's force. There's a quantity piece, but there's a quality to that quantity piece. Tactically, what was the Soviet focus? Anti-carrier warfare. So maybe the Soviets didn't get the memo about how obsolete the aircraft carrier was, right? And as well as the more traditional focus on submarine and anti-submarine warfare. One, because of the nuclear triad of the Americans, anti-submarine warfare. Two, anti-submarine warfare because of the American submarine warfare coming into the bastions and hunting the Soviet submarines. So those were the priorities in these exercises. Okay. I talk a little bit about the Mayaguez, but that's just to kind of highlight the readiness of the United States at the time. And if we can move ahead to Eagle Claw and the Iran hostage rescue, you can just continue to see this train of woes as the United States tries to kind of get the military back into a position where it can do crisis and contingency response operations using toward naval forces and everything. Well, the U.S. strategy might best be termed as reactive sea control strategy, at least when Holloway took over, all right? Its focus was to protect the sea lanes, as I mentioned. We've already talked about Rickover, and Rickover, it's not just that Rickover likes energy, but the 1973 tipping point was guys like me in gas lines in our Pintos that stretched for miles and miles. And oh, by the way, they would come back in 1974 as the oil embargo was re-implemented. So Rickover had a method to his madness. He said, oil's a problem, So one reason he's really pushing the all-nuclear Navy, the surface Navy fleet, again, as expensive it is, it's horribly, horribly expensive, is because of this dependence on Middle Eastern oil at the time too, which is often forgotten. He's the guy who makes the comparison that this is a huge change, that nuclear propulsion is huge. It's the equivalent of the dreadnought change that occurs, over 80 years earlier with Jackie Fisher and the dreadnought changing from coal-powered steam plants to turbines and to petroleum. Holloway, like Rickover, realized that the real battle to support the maritime strategy saw conflict with the Soviet fleet in the North Atlantic, but also around the globe. So he didn't say one fleet. He did not want a one-ocean navy. He wanted a two-ocean navy. And I think when he had commanded 7th Fleet, he'd actually practiced doing that flank attack against the Soviet Far Eastern fleet, the Red Banner fleet in the Far East in Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk with 4 carrier battle groups. So he had sort of previewed the kind of exercises we'd see again when I was a youngster flying for 3 carrier battle group operations in 1984 and 1985 in the Far East, in the East China Sea and the Sea of Japan. Actually, we only put 2 in the Sea of Japan. It was the Midway, and I forget the other one. And Holloway knew it was going to take a public relations campaign. And so he leveraged the United States Naval Institute proceedings. Now, here I'm going to take an aside on what do you do when all the archives are closed? All right. Where can you find primary source data to get a view of what Jim Holloway was thinking, what the naval community was thinking? Think of it this way. These pubs like Proceedings, Parameters, Air and Space Power Journal, Military Review, they are culture talking to themselves, culture talking to itself. So I said, well, I'm a Naval Institute member. I can get digital access. And so I'll do that. That's how I'll do my research. And I said, I bet you Holloway sent something out to the fleet when he took over in Proceedings. And by golly, he did. And I found this one issue of Proceedings that was like a gold mine because it had everything in it. It had articles by Rickover. It had articles by Sergei Gorshkov from Moscow Soboynik. I mean, so I said, I hit the jackpot. And so I'll kind of continue there. So he went to something called the President's Page, which back then the CNO was the president of the Naval Institute. And he laid his thoughts out. And he asked the readership of the Navy to serve as the spokesman to the public about public awareness of defense budget approaching $100 billion and a defense budget that needed to pay more attention to the United States Navy, all right? Needed to solve this problem of the shrinking fleet, the amazing shrinking fleet that's headed towards 300 ships if something isn't done. Well, I say this, but Ed actually claims it. The maritime strategy of the 1970s, you can see it in this 1975 article. First, he addressed the budget context, emphasizing how much the budget had been reduced, the plans to reduce it further, and how it had negatively impacted the Navy. His second point was to emphasize, and this is for the Naval Institute Proceedings audience in the President's Page in 1975. The second point was to emphasize, as we cut our fleet, the Soviets built their fleet up. As we were cutting ours, they built theirs up, a situation analogous to US and China today. And then he cited that the Soviets spent 15% more on new ship construction than we did. His third point for his institutional audience was that the US and Soviet trends occurred against a backdrop of shifting power relationships in the world today, to which the changing Soviet military balance itself had contributed significantly. I have here, translation, the Soviets' increase in military and maritime power was changing the geopolitical balance in favor of the Soviet Union. I mean, in surrounding issues of Proceedings, there's stories, both in the back and in the main parts of Proceedings, showing pictures of Soviet ships visiting US ports and US ships visiting Soviet ports back in the 1970s. That's where we were at with Daytona, okay? And this surrounds Jim Holloway's clarion call to action for us, the Naval Institute audience, to get out there and tell the American public that the US Navy is important to our strategy in the Cold War. He said then, what is the role of the Navy? The first thing he talked about, of course, was nuclear deterrence. But secondly, and presumably second priority, was to keep the sea lines of communication. So these two points reflected a one ocean Navy strategy, but Holloway was having none of it. He wanted a two ocean strategy. His third point encompassed the ability to project US power ashore to protect our vital interests, that we needed background, that we needed presence. That vital interest encompassed crises, and they could only be met, and this is his term, with hedges. So this is the emergence of that hedging aspect of the maritime strategy, that we're going to hedge, all right? We're not going to go with the high-low mix. We're going to go with more of a, high-low mix, sort of an approach, if you want to think about it that way. His fourth point in this very, very short 2.5-page piece is that fourth, perhaps most important of the mission of the Navy for the era of peace we seek is overseas presence. We've got to get the presence overseas, and we can't do that with the readiness we have right now. Okay, you've got to get out there and tell Congress to give us more money so we can fix our ships, so they can pull out of ports, and so that sailors can be at sea where they belong, doing our Navy's business. The existence, and these are his words, of our Navy demonstrates to those who would deny us the free use of the seas that hostile challenges to our interest or those of our allies may result in a confrontation with U.S. armed forces. In other words, we're not going to shrink back into a garrison Navy and kind of have just sort of minor little pieces and parts out there. We want people to know that we can react with violence, if need be, as crises, which are often unforeseen, arise. He specifically mentioned the Mediterranean, where World War II almost started, according to Barney Rubble in 1973, as well as the Pacific and Indian Oceans, where an Indian Ocean Indo-Pakistani war had taken place, and where we'd actually seen the use of anti-ship cruise missiles in that battle. Well, it's just about time to finish this up. So he emphasized two major issues. First, we needed a strategy, and his plan for that was something called Sea Plan 2000. Eventually, he promulgated it, all right, but it was never formally accepted, as mentioned, by the Carter administration. And in some sense, Holloway fails. I mean, we talk about Zumwalt coming up short. Holloway comes up short too. And I think it's interesting to look at the role of contingency in history and sort of affecting what's going on, because the budget continues to decrease. His plan for a two-ocean maritime strategy, encompassed in the ideas of Sea Plan 2000, is not implemented. Readiness is still abysmal, even though he's working very, very hard to improve it at the time. One of the big problems, of course, was drugs, but it's a two-edged sword, which is, well, how many chances do we give people with drugs and alcohol abuse? But at the same time, we're having problems getting people to stay in the Navy. So do we really want to get rid of somebody at the same time that we're having problems getting people in? And it was one of these, death dilemmas, Certainly Holloway would have loved to have had random drug testing. And I forget whether it was him or Hayward who finally introduced the random drug testing, but Holloway would have loved to have had that. In the very same issue, of course, I mentioned clever editors had Gorshkov in there with his view of what the Soviet Union was going to do, and it matched up entirely with what Holloway said we needed to do with the U.S. Navy to address the Soviet global naval threat with presence and power projection. All right, so it just reinforced the clever editors of Proceedings put this republication of the Gorshkov piece in Moscow Soboynik, which is their version of Proceedings, and it just kind of hammers home his points. One of the things that happens here, and I'm going to kind of go off script because I'm kind of there, is that catastrophe sort of rescues all of this in some sense. Okay, just like the Korean War kind of saved naval aviation and the Navy. All right. The Iran hostage crisis and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan provided sort of the necessary momentum for change and for a new administration, in some sense, to start to make some of the changes and things that Holloway wanted done. Carter passed one thing that Carter and Holloway did agree on was pay scales, and that did occur on Holloway and then Hayward's watch as President Carter supported those increase in pay scales. But so don't think of Jim Holloway as just a steady-as-she-goes guy. He's a guy who's also providing preparatory fires in support to lay the groundwork when we do get Peter Schwartz and John Lehman and Jim Crow and Joe Seastack and all these guys come flooding in, and we get all this bright stuff going on. And it's not like they come up with this in a vacuum. They have this template that Jim Holloway had put out there and had been working on since 1975 to sort of make part of the consciousness of the Navy and to sort of revitalize the strategic culture of the Navy. So if there's a big takeaway here is that Jim Holloway's big input here is part of that revitalization. I think Bud Zumwalt did it too with the people and kind of getting the ball rolling. But Jim Holloway also deserves equal credit, if not perhaps more. The consolidators don't nearly get the credit that they do. The quiet guys, they're the guys that get a lot done in this town because they don't need the credit. And on that note, I'll end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. I failed to mention that we also have a murderer's row of naval historians in the audience. John Hatdorf, Craig Simons, Norm Freeman, and I think it's Nick Lambert online. So any comments that I was going to make, we'll certainly take a back seat to any questions, particularly these guys asked. So what we're going to do is going to ask 2 questions from folks in the room, and that'll give time to open it up, and then we'll see how many questions we can get answered online. We have about 20 minutes. So Norm.
Well, if you look back at Zumwalt, the fact that he had no major command experience and his being a service officer, I think have been downrated as important factors. If you look at dealing with the Russians in the Mediterranean, the carriers provide a hell of a lot of anti-ship capability. And he's acting as though they don't exist. That's because he's a surface guy. If you look at Soviet problems targeting us, a lot of them are command and control problems that are not appreciated because when he sees all the Soviet missiles, he becomes obsessed with them. Oh, and by the way, a lot of the missiles are anti-ship, which is an intelligence problem. I think that people looking at him sometimes forget that. And Holloway would have had a much broader experience. It's not that if you're a surface guy, you can't understand your airplanes. The Navy got very good at that. But he in particular had an unusually narrow pre-CNO experience that's been brought out. We might want to dwell on that.
Anybody want to comment on that?
Yeah, I was captain of 3 ships, first during Zumwalt's time in Vietnam, and then during his time, and I knew him because the first ship I was ordered to from the Naval Academy, he was captain. So I got my first letter from Admiral Zumwalt. I think that his change when I went aboard the Arnold J. Isbell, he had just left, but his legacy was very. I mean, he had left a very strong impression on those people, and he had planned out his career. And all the officers on the Isbell would tell you, "Oh yeah, he's going to go be so, then he'll be aide to the Secretary of the Navy, and then he'll command a cruiser, and then he'll go be an admiral." Well, the only thing that screwed up was he never got the cruiser. He made captain too fast, and then made admiral, and the next thing you know, he was gone. As far as the Soviet Navy in the Mediterranean was concerned, I came from Vietnam here to the Naval Academy just as they were changing to the majors program. So my first year here was the first year of the majors program, and I was the chairman of the Seamanship and Tactics Department. And I had an Australian officer who worked for me, clever guy. And there was the big fuss about what are we going to do about the Mediterranean, all those Soviet ships are going to go out there. And he looked at me one day and he said, "What are you planning on doing out there? Having a regatta?" Well, there was something to be said for that point of view. And then in the destroyers that I commanded under Zumwalt, the most impressive thing was the change in racial relations. The idea of a captain of a ship sitting down with the crew in a session, what do they call it?
Rap session?
No, they had some other. It was professionally done. You had to have a psychiatrist come in, and
All 40 seminars.
Sensitivity training.
Yeah, right.
It's called sensitivity training, and we all went to sensitivity training. Then I had command from that ship, which was homeported in Mayport, Florida. I went to command of a reserve force ship in Tampa, Florida. It was the only ship in Tampa, Florida. And I had a race rider. And by that time, racial relations had become sufficiently noteworthy that there was a format for an off-rep 3 if you had a racial problem aboard ship. And the racial problem that you expected to have was a bunch of minority sailors sitting across the flight deck saying, "You ain't flying off this ship until I get my rights." That can be very scary. My race riot was a flight sailor walking aboard a ship, grabbing a dogging wrench and saying, "I'm going to kill Ike," and being joined by 5 people who were in agreement with it. I'm going to call the Tampa City Police because the reserve force ship doesn't have a full crew. And at night, you had about 30 people aboard total. And this guy was going to cause a riot. And the ship was getting ready to deploy like 2 days later. So Zumwalt dealt with those problems, I think, probably more directly because he had to. I mean, the racial relations thing, we had I don't know how many ships that had minority sailors just said, "We're not going to go to work." and like I say, a bunch of them lined up on a carrier flight.
Well,
deck.
Constellation in San Diego
Yeah, and they
Yeah.
said,
refused to go to war.
They had
We're not
the
gonna do
XO.
and the Navy has always prided itself on never having had a mutiny. Well, that just depends on how you define a mutiny. In terms of nobody was ever charged,
Yeah.
but those are the sorts of things that went on.
Well, we have the impression that it happened in 3 ships. It's always, Constellation, Hassayampa was an oiler, and Kitty Hawk. But it was actually widespread in
Yeah,
all
yeah,
the
you're
oceans.
right.
It wasn't just out in the Pacific. It was Navy-wide, the shore bases. And you've heard the stories. People can't walk through the passageways without being assaulted by black or white or whatever. So it was a serious problem. That's to his credit. He
Yeah,
said, we
that's
can't
right.
just
He
do
took it
this
on.
in normal bureaucratic fashion. We've got to go at this tooth and nail. So he brought in psychiatrists and, sensitivity training and all that, which the critics said, well, this is all amateurish and ad hoc and put together overnight. But something had to be done. I mean, we were in serious trouble. It wasn't just the Navy. The other services had similar problems. So he took the bull by the horns, and yeah, there were tough problems with it, the execution, but it had to be done.
And we all learned something. I mean, if you were captain of a ship prior to that time, you didn't sit on the nest decks with the seamen. I mean, I guess you could, but nobody did. And after that, they did. And it made a huge difference in the way you ran the ship. You didn't wait to hear from the exec. You went down and found out for yourself what was going on. Go down to the engineering spaces and check water with one of the VTs. And you learn something about his family and what makes him tick and why he's happy to sit there in 175 degree heat with no air conditioning and do that every 4 hours, every 4 out of 8 hours. And it was an amazing learning experience that the whole Navy went through and came out of, I think, much better.
So you got about 12 minutes left. Question from, looks like from Newport, John Scott Logo. For the panel, given the tension between a programmatic-oriented CNO and a command experienced CNO, what might you recommend to CNO Gilday and whoever succeeds them in thinking about issues facing the Navy over the next decade? And here, I think he's talking about Zumwalt was very much a programmatic. He was probably the first real programmatic CNO, but he also kind of balanced that with a strategic approach that few programmatic CNOs past that did, and a command experience, which of course is Holloway and as well as Hayward. You might want to take that one.
No?
That's all right, just
That's a great question.
just
That's a
stand for
question.
target on my head. Look, if you don't know planning, programming, and budgeting, you're gonna be lost if you're the chief of naval operations. You have to have had significant experience in that, or you must have somebody next to you, either the vice chief or the chief programming officer, who's really very good at this. This really matters. On the other hand, Zumwalt hadn't had the kind of commands that his successor did. And those matter. Fleet commands matter. A lot of people don't understand this, especially people outside the Navy. They don't, because they don't get to see it. They don't get to participate in it. And they don't realize what fleet commanders do, or even battle group commanders do. This is something you learn by doing. And if you have a CNO who hasn't done it, then you have a CNO who doesn't understand the battle strength of the Navy. And that's very important.
Well, I think we need to remember too, that this is a really interesting, fraught era. And Chafee choosing, and not just Chafee, but sort of this galaxy of people, that's kind of reaching in and choosing this programmatic guy, Op 96 guy, Zumwalt, to send him in there to do this. The challenges were significant, and so we don't want to underplay those. But yeah, you want that fleet experience coming into it. You want those guys. You have to have some people that you listen to that you're willing to listen to and entertain what they have to say, who have that sort of experience. And if you don't have it yourself, or if you only have one leg of this two-legged thing, programmatic versus fleet, number fleet command or area fleet command, then you go with the team approach, or you go with the committee approach. But you have to be careful to avoid sort of the groupthink approach. But I think Zumwalt's an anomaly. He was sort of the right guy for the right place at the right time. Okay, now he broke a lot of eggs, and other people had to kind of go back and make omelets out of him. But it was unique, and I don't think he is sort of the standard in terms of what we should expect. All right, but during these times of crisis, particularly with these horrible social cultural, I sat on a hill in Bloomington, Indiana, as a 12-year-old and watched the library burn in 1969. Okay, so it's difficult to translate to everybody how horrible things were back then. I mean, in terms of social and cultural and race. I mean, people were still talking about it when guys like me came in the 80s.
Yeah,
I would just add to what the panelists talked about with respect to currency, current situation. I love the parallels that have been drawn here, but I would submit that since Zumwalt and Holloway, Zumwalt being the first programming guy at CNO, so that's what OpNet has become. And as Steve Wills has recently published and others have argued, the strategic planning side of OpNet has just gone away and it no longer exists. And you know that as well as I do from my time here. And so, the advice to today's Navy leadership is, okay, you guys, CNO's got the vice chief who's an NA, he's a programming guy, great. But what is lacking today is the balance on the other side. We publish these glossy, full of pictures, really cool, slick publications that look great. They go on coffee tables and flag offices, but nobody reads them, and it's certainly not compelling to the programming side. It's irrelevant. And so that's what I think needs to be restored, is that balance where, and I think Admiral Richardson tried to start doing this, but rebalance and get strategy more in as a more compelling part of what goes on in that. That's a huge job.
Great point, Jerry. Him. Everybody else? Any more? Let's see. We got 5 minutes.
The question for John, how much did the impact of the Sino-Soviet split influence Soviet influence?
Well, that's kind of going back a little bit, but I mean, at the time, it was more at the geopolitical, what I would call the civilian national security policy level, with guys like the National Security Advisor and Kissinger, and then of course Secretary of State Kissinger, SecDef level, deputy assistant SecDefs for policy, deputy Secretary of Defense. It's at that level where I think that had the most impact, but it didn't deliver any operational bang for the buck. All right, at least in the maritime sphere. Okay, that's my hypothesis. I need to go out and gather some more evidence.
Yeah, well, you're talking about a more aggressive Soviet foreign policy, particularly in Africa. They're helping the Cubans, rapidly build up in Africa, supporting revolutions throughout Africa and in the Middle East.
Well, and that was known, and it was in the intelligence, and the Gorbachev, or not Gorbachev, the Gorshkov reprint article talks about that, which is, we need presence too if we're going to support this strategy of worldwide revolution, which Khrushchev had implemented, and which Brezhnev inherited and continued. All right, perhaps more ruthlessly, but so that was known. But the Sino-Soviet split was more at that geostrategic level, and its bang for the buck out on the oceans, just it wasn't that much. That would be my hypothesis. I don't think it was that much of an effect on the Red Banner fleet, where it was going, what it wanted to do, and I kind of listed those areas: submarine warfare, anti-submarine warfare, anti-carrier warfare. And again, there's this whole other area over here that involves the nuclear problem that has to do with second strike and counter strike and all that kind of stuff. And those elements of the maritime strategy, which you haven't even talked about with respect to the emerging paradigm that there are these bastions in the Sea of the Coast and up there north of the North Cape in the White Sea and that area. So we haven't even brushed on those. But I don't think that piece of the Chinese problem was more a continental problem. It was more of a continental deal. It was now the Soviets have nuclear armed power on their borders that's no longer, that's kind of aligning with the United States. And then of course with Deng Xiaoping, it becomes what, but again, it's more of at the geopolitical continental sort of strategic level.
Well, I also mentioned too, the fact too, that, the Soviets began using Cameron Bay after we evacuated.
Oh, don't I know it? I mean, 600 hours flying off that thing in an ET-3. No, everybody always forgets about that. Oh yeah, the Vietnam War didn't do anything. Well, in the maritime realm, it did a huge number on our sea lines of communication through the South China Sea and Strait of Malacca into the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf because of the Carter Doctrine, which we absolutely had to have. And if the Egyptians closed down the Suez Canal like they did after El Dorado Canyon, you were stuck with one place, and guess who's sitting there watching you go by? Those submarines and those bears and that Carrier class cruiser, they're all sitting in Cameron Bay.
All right,
Sorry.
we got time for one more question. Yes, John.
One comment, really. I like the idea of one person being an innovator, somewhat, and then a stabilizer in terms of Holloway. What I push back is to say that one is better than the other.
Right.
In those days, the bureaucracy had to change. Both Zumwalt and Sansfield Turner explicitly believed that change had to be violent and it had to be extreme, and both knew that the follow-on person would bring it back and stabilize it. And so they go together, and they're a necessary pair. Holloway didn't roll things back as a successor might have done, but he stabilized it in a way that he accepted.
Yeah, complimentary.
So you reinforce the point that they were a shake and bake team. I would say that
John came in after that, so that's what it's referred to as I called that tandem, the shake and bake of the Cold War.
and Zumwalt was the Ricky Bobby with his underwear on fire.
All right, let's see. I think everybody can understand the quality of our historians by the quality of people sitting in the audience in this room and online. So some of the finest American naval historians are in this room right now or online and listening to these three brilliant gentlemen. So let's give them a round of applause and. All right, I'll see most of you guys at lunch. I gotta
Good session. Oh, yeah, it's good.
I'm gonna get some. I finally got you.